when Blake Harlow slammed the glass table and snapped, "Take 50% less or leave." The room assumed he had won the negotiation. In reality, he just ignited a collapse worth tens of millions of dollars. He forgot I held the relationships keeping this company alive. One short phone call to his biggest competitor turned his arrogant ultimatum into his most expensive mistake. By the time he realized he was severing his own future, the door was already shut. My name is Nora Wood. I am 39 years old, and for the past 11 years, I have poured every ounce of my professional life into Halcyon Root Systems. Halcyon is a sprawling cold-chain logistics empire headquartered in Atlanta, responsible for moving highly sensitive medical supplies across the country. As the National Director of Client Strategy, I did not just manage accounts. I built the entire critical healthcare network that kept this company profitable. I knew the buyers, I knew the strict compliance regulations, and most importantly, I held the absolute trust of the people who signed the multi-million-dollar contracts, or at least I did until this exact moment. The air in the high-floor boardroom was thick and suffocating, carrying the distinct, metallic taste of corporate desperation. We were weeks away from the end of the financial quarter, a time when the pressure to deliver perfect numbers usually turned executives into predators. Today, however, the predatory gaze was fixed entirely on me. 6 members of the senior leadership team sat around a massive, custom-built glass table. The room was soundproofed, isolating us from the bustling city of Atlanta hundreds of feet below, creating an oppressive vacuum where careers could be quietly executed without anyone hearing the screams. At the head of the table sat Blake Harlow, our Chief Executive Officer. Blake was a man whose arrogance was exceeded only by his short-sightedness. He did not bother with pleasantries. He simply slid a thin manila folder across the polished glass. The friction of the paper against the table produced a sharp, scraping sound that echoed loudly in the dead silence. I picked the folder up, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression, a skill honed over a decade of high-stakes corporate negotiations. I opened it and scanned the single sheet of paper inside. It took only a few seconds to absorb the numbers, but I forced myself to read every line twice to ensure I was not hallucinating. I had expected a difficult conversation about budget constraints, or perhaps a reduction in my end-of-year performance bonus. What I held in my hands was not a standard financial adjustment. It was a formal proposal to slash my total compensation by exactly 50%, but the financial devastation was only the first blow. The second paragraph outlined a comprehensive restructuring of my authority. The document dictated that I would be stripped of nearly all decision-making power regarding the major medical accounts I had built from absolutely nothing. I was to become a glorified babysitter for the clients, maintaining the relationships while turning over the actual strategic control to executives who had never even stepped foot inside a pharmaceutical warehouse. Halcyon wanted to keep the revenue my relationships generated, but they wanted me to do the heavy lifting for half the price and zero respect. I lifted my eyes from the paper. Dana Mercer, our head of human resources, was staring intensely at her notepad, suddenly paralyzed by the sight of her own handwriting. Miriam Sloan, the lead counsel from the legal department, sat rigidly beside her. Her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. Both women radiated a palpable sense of panic. They knew the intricacies of my employment contract better than anyone else in the room. They knew that a 50% cut in pay, combined with a severe demotion in duties, vastly exceeded the safe threshold of adjustment we had legally agreed upon. They were fully aware that Blake was dragging the company across a very dangerous, highly actionable line. Sensing the heavy, toxic silence, Reed Talbot, our chief financial officer, attempted to play the role of the peacemaker. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and cleared his throat. "Nora," Reed began, utilizing that soft, condescending tone corporate men reserve for women they are about to screw over, "we really need you to look at this through the lens of a broader market correction. The logistics industry is experiencing a massive shift, and Halcyon is currently undergoing a strategic leadership realignment to stay competitive. We value your contributions immensely. You are a pillar here. but we must ensure the company remains financially agile going into the next fiscal year." I stared at him blankly. Market correction and leadership realignment were cowardly synonyms for daylight robbery. Everyone in that room knew the truth. Halcyon was bleeding cash because of a recent string of operational failures, and Blake was trying to artificially inflate the quarterly profit margins by cannibalizing his own senior staff. Blake, never one to tolerate diplomatic posturing when blunt force would do, lost his limited patience. He let out a sharp sigh, leaned forward, and raised his right hand. He brought his palm down hard against the glass table. The loud smack caused both Dana and Miriam to physically jolt in their seats. "Let us cut the corporate poetry, Reed," Blake snapped, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He locked his cold, dark eyes onto mine. "The numbers are what they are. Nora, take 50% less or leave." The room instantly felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out through the ventilation shafts. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and expectant. They were waiting for the explosion. They expected me to burst into tears, to scream about fairness, to list the 11 years of my life I had sacrificed, the weekends I had missed, the millions in revenue I had personally secured. They wanted an emotional breakdown so they could label me irrational and justify their reckless decision. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not let even a micro-expression of anger betray my composure. I moved deliberately, closing the folder and aligning its edges perfectly with the edge of the glass table. I looked slowly around the room, making deliberate eye contact with Reed, then Dana, then Miriam, before finally resting my gaze on Blake. "I have heard your proposal," I said, my voice steady, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I will require exactly 24 hours to review this document in detail and provide my formal response." I stood up, picked up the manila folder, and tucked it neatly under my arm. I turned and began walking toward the heavy oak door leading out to the hallway. I was 3 steps away when Blake's voice rang out, unable to resist getting the last word. "Take your 24 hours, Nora," he said, a cruel, dismissive sneer lacing his words. "But do not overthink it. You have absolutely no leverage here." I paused with my hand resting on the cool metal of the door handle. I did not turn around to look at him, but in my peripheral vision, I could see the immediate reaction of the room. 2 of the executives, Dana and Miriam, simultaneously shifted their gaze downward, completely avoiding looking at my back. They felt the sheer weight of Blake's hubris, even if he was entirely oblivious to it. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the brightly lit corridor, leaving the tense silence of the boardroom behind me. As the heavy wooden door clicked shut, a profound, razor-sharp clarity washed over me. Blake Harlow genuinely believed he had just backed a helpless employee into a corner. He thought his aggressive tactics had secured a decisive victory for his balance sheet. But as I walked down the hall, the gears in my mind were already locking into place, calculating the exact trajectory of his impending downfall. They thought they had just pushed me against a wall and trapped me. They did not realize that they had just locked themselves in a room with absolutely no way out. The walk back to my private office felt like navigating through a parallel dimension. I pushed open the heavy glass door, cleanly severing the low, frantic hum of the national sales floor behind me. Out there, the massive logistics engine of Halcyon was running at its usual breakneck speed. Coordinators were shouting into headsets about refrigerated freight delays. Junior account managers were furiously typing up weekly reports, and corporate life was continuing exactly as it had an hour prior. But in here, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. As the latch clicked shut, the silence wrapped around me. My entire career had just been unceremoniously thrown onto an operating table, and I was entirely alone in the room with the scalpels. I did not pace. I did not throw my bag against the wall or collapse into my ergonomic chair in a fit of despair. Instead, I walked straight to the locked filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the room. 4 years ago, when I was officially elevated to the position of National Strategic Director, I had refused to sign the standard, boilerplate human resources paperwork. I knew the immense value of the client portfolio I was bringing to the executive level. I had hired independent outside counsel to draft a meticulous, ironclad employment agreement. At the time, upper management had grumbled about my paranoia. Today, that exact paranoia was the only thing standing between me and professional execution. I pulled the thick, leather-bound document from the bottom drawer, carried it to my desk, and laid it flat beneath the glow of my brass reading lamp. I did not open it with shaking hands or a racing heart. I opened the pages with the exact same cold, calculated precision I utilized when tearing apart a $300 million vendor logistics contract. I bypassed the standard introductory clauses and went straight for the termination conditions, tracing the dense, convoluted legal jargon with my index finger, and there it was, sitting quietly on page 14. Section 8, subsection C. The good reason clause, known formally in employment law as constructive termination, the language was beautifully unambiguous. It stated clearly that if the company unilaterally reduced my total compensation beyond a strict 5% threshold, or if they materially diminished my executive authority, operational oversight, and strategic control over my designated accounts, I was legally entitled to consider their actions a forced, involuntary resignation. Halcyon could not simply slash my pay and box me out of my own client relationships without tripping this exact, highly sensitive wire. Blake's demand of a 50% reduction was not merely crossing a legal boundary, it was driving a bulldozer right through it. But the true devastating power of a brilliantly negotiated contract lies in its cascading effects. I turned the page, meticulously following the cross-referenced clauses. Blake, in his arrogant rush to trim the departmental budget, had clearly not ordered legal to review the deeper archives thoroughly. If a constructive termination was triggered under these specific circumstances, a massive, hidden set of trapdoors swung wide open beneath the company's feet. First, the clause activated an aggressive severance package, legally obligating Halcyon to pay out my full base salary for the next 24 months. Second, and infinitely more dangerous to an already strained balance sheet, it triggered the immediate, accelerated vesting of all my deferred equity and company stock options. Every single share I had earned over 11 years of service would instantly mature, becoming fully payable upon my exit. Finally, the contract legally bound the corporation to provide a strictly neutral professional reference, stripping Blake and his team of any ability to control the narrative or smear my reputation in the industry after I walked out the door. I reached for my cell phone and dialed the private number of my longtime employment attorney, Owen Carlyle. Owen was a brilliant, vicious litigator who disguised himself as a mild-mannered academic in tweed suits. He was the architect who had helped me build these exact contractual defenses 4 years ago. He answered on the second ring. "Owen," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "I need you to clear your schedule for the rest of the evening." "Nora," he replied, a hint of concern breaking through his usually stoic demeanor. "It is barely 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday." What exactly did they do? Blake Harlow just slid a piece of paper across a boardroom table demanding a 50% reduction in my total compensation. In addition, the proposal effectively strips me of all operational control over the national medical accounts I built. He attempted to frame it as a standard market correction. There was a heavy, profound pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of Owen shifting forward in his leather chair, the casualness entirely evaporating from his posture. "He put a 50% cut in writing," Owen asked, his tone sharpening into a razor edge. "And he is actively touching your designated account authority." "Yes. He gave me exactly 24 hours to accept the terms or leave the building. Do not sign a single document. Do not send an email confirming receipt," Owen commanded, his voice taking on the rapid authoritative clip of a general preparing for war. "Scan that proposal and send it to my encrypted server right now, along with a fresh copy of your master employment agreement. This is absolutely not a market correction. Nora, Blake just handed you the keys to the corporate vault." He has opened Halcyon up to a massive, highly expensive breach of contract dispute. I want everything in my inbox within the hour. I will send the files over within 10 minutes, I confirmed, before ending the call. I set the phone down and leaned back, letting the heavy silence of the office wash over me again. The initial shock of the ambush had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, diagnostic clarity. I began to mentally reconstruct the past 6 months of Halcyon's internal operations, piecing together the invisible puzzle. Why would Blake take a risk this monumental? He was an arrogant man, certainly, but he was rarely a suicidal leader. He did not act out of personal hatred or petty vindictiveness toward me. In the high-stakes corporate world, actions this sudden and drastic were almost never driven by emotion. They were driven by sheer, unadulterated terror. I looked at the large quarterly calendar pinned to my wall. The end of the fiscal year was rapidly approaching. Halcyon had recently authorized spending tens of millions of dollars on a massive, state-of-the-art warehouse automation project across the southern region. It was supposed to be Blake's crowning achievement. Instead, the implementation had spectacularly failed. The software integration was entirely botched, critical supply chains were hopelessly bottlenecked, and the company's profit margins were currently bleeding out on the concrete floors of our own fulfillment centers. Blake was panicking. He desperately needed to present an artificially inflated, beautifully trimmed balance sheet to the board of directors in a few short weeks to hide the massive losses. He was not trying to manage my career or correct the market. He was trying to sacrifice my salary to aggressively plug a gaping financial hole caused by his own catastrophic mismanagement before the board could see the blood on the ledger. He needed a high-value scapegoat, and he mistakenly believed my paycheck was the easiest target to harvest. My gaze drifted slowly toward the stack of industry trade magazines sitting on the corner of my mahogany desk. On the glossy cover of the top issue was a face I recognized instantly: Evelyn Drake. Evelyn was the chief executive officer of Northforge Logistics, our absolute fiercest and most heavily funded competitor on the eastern seaboard. Several months ago, during a massive medical supply chain summit in Miami, Evelyn had strategically cornered me near the quiet lobby bar after a keynote speech. It was not a casual networking chat. She had asked highly specific, probing questions about my operational capacity, my vision for the healthcare sector, and my long-term career goals. She had planted a very deliberate seed, making it perfectly clear that Northforge was watching my work with intense, predatory interest. I had politely deflected her inquiries at the time, bound by my deep loyalty to Halcyon. That loyalty had just been formally extinguished. I picked up my phone again, entirely bypassing my corporate email application and opening my encrypted private messages. I found the direct number Evelyn had handed me on a minimalist, embossed business card back in Miami. I did not need to draft a long, emotional paragraph detailing my grievances. I did not need to explain the boardroom ambush or sound the least bit desperate. I simply needed to let her know that the most valuable piece on the board was finally in play. I typed a single, precise sentence. Evelyn, the landscape has shifted, and I am ready to hear what Northforge is building. I pressed send. I placed the phone face down on the polished wood of my desk and waited, my eyes fixed on the device. I did not have to wait long. Less than 3 minutes later, the phone violently vibrated, a sharp, angry buzz that shattered the quiet tension of the room. I slowly reached out and flipped the screen over. The reply from Evelyn Drake was exactly 4 words long. Breakfast tomorrow. 7 sharp. The drive to Charlotte took roughly 4 hours, providing me with ample silence to organize my strategy before the sun even fully breached the horizon. The location Evelyn Drake chose for our meeting was a masterful display of corporate diplomacy. It was a high-end, discreet coffeehouse, situated exactly 3 blocks from the sprawling glass campus of Northforge Logistics. The venue featured deep, high-backed leather booths and a constant low hum of grinding espresso beans that naturally scrambled private conversations. It was an environment intimate enough to discuss high-level corporate defections, yet public enough that if anyone from the industry happened to walk in, It would simply look like two veteran executives catching up over a morning brew. Evelyn arrived precisely at 7 o'clock. She wore an impeccably tailored charcoal blazer and carried an aura of quiet, lethal competence that stood in stark contrast to the table-slapping tantrums I had endured the previous afternoon. She slid into the booth opposite me, ordered a black coffee, and entirely skipped the performative small talk. North Forge has the capital and the infrastructure to completely dominate the southeastern medical corridor, Evelyn began, keeping her voice pitched just below the ambient noise of the cafe. What we currently lack is the precise architecture. We have been trying to penetrate that specific network for 2 years. We need someone who deeply understands the volatile intersection of cold chain logistics, strict federal compliance, and the delicate psychology of the national hospital purchasing groups. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes locking onto mine with an intense, evaluating focus. My current chief executive presented me with a very blunt ultimatum yesterday, I said, keeping my tone clinical and entirely devoid of self-pity. He formally proposed reducing my total compensation by 50%, while simultaneously removing my strategic oversight of the key accounts. Evelyn's expression barely shifted. She was far too seasoned to show surprise, but a distinct flicker of predatory calculation flashed behind her eyes. I am not sitting here to complain about unfair treatment, I continued, folding my hands neatly on the wooden table. I am here to ask a structural question about the future. If I transition my career to North Forge, I need to know what exactly we are building, and what level of autonomy I will have to build it. This was the critical juncture. A lesser executive might have showered me with cinematic promises of revenge and instant gratification. Evelyn did not offer me a fairy tale. She responded with the cold, pragmatic reality of high-level corporate maneuvering, which only increased my respect for her. We are a publicly traded entity, Evelyn explained, leaning slightly forward. Any executive compensation package of that magnitude requires a formal presentation to the board of directors. We also have to meticulously structure your new role to ensure we do not trigger the restrictive covenants buried in your current non-compete clauses. We cannot simply poach your existing clients on day one. But let me be absolutely clear. The mandate for a new national growth division is fully funded and waiting for a green light. We do not just want to buy a well-connected employee. We want to build an entirely new, parallel revenue stream around the exact relationships you have spent over a decade cultivating. She paused, swirling the dark liquid in her mug, before delivering the final, validating piece of intelligence. Besides, Evelyn added, a razor-thin smile finally touching the corners of her mouth, the whisper network in the procurement sector has been incredibly loud over the past few weeks. Everyone in the industry knows your leadership team is currently drowning. We heard that the massive automated warehousing initiative your company launched last year is a complete operational disaster. It sounds very much like your boss is frantically trying to amputate the wrong limbs to hide the bleeding from his investors. Hearing my own private deductions confirmed by the chief executive of our fiercest rival was an incredibly grounding experience. It solidified my understanding of the battlefield. Blake was not operating from a position of strength. He was thrashing wildly in deep water. I did not eagerly nod my head. I did not ask for a pen to sign a napkin, nor did I offer a desperate verbal commitment. I simply maintained eye contact, acknowledging the immense value of the door she had just unlocked. For the first time since I had walked out of that suffocating boardroom, the absolute power of choice had returned to my hands. I thanked Evelyn for her time, paid for my own tea, and walked out into the crisp Carolina morning. I had a long drive back to Atlanta, and I needed to prepare for the counterstrike. Exactly 24 hours after Blake had delivered his arrogant ultimatum, I bypassed my own office and walked straight into the Human Resources suite on the executive floor. Dana Mercer and Miriam Sloan were already waiting for me in a small, windowless conference room. They looked visibly more exhausted than they had the previous afternoon. The air in the room was heavy with nervous anticipation. They were expecting me to either hand over a bitter letter of resignation or tragically capitulate to the new, humiliating terms. I did neither. I sat down in the chair opposite them and placed a thick, neatly bound portfolio on the center of the table. My demeanor was entirely different from the quiet stoicism I had displayed yesterday. Today, I was armored. "Inside that folder," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the bare acoustic panels, "you will find a certified copy of my original employment agreement. Behind it is a formal letter of review, drafted and signed by my retained legal counsel, Owen Carlyle." Dana physically flinched at the mention of outside legal representation. Miriam, operating on pure legal instinct, immediately reached for the folder and flipped it open to Owen's heavy, intimidating letterhead. Her eyes darted rapidly across the dense paragraphs, and I watched the remaining color completely drain from her face as she absorbed the meticulous legal trap we had laid out. "For the official corporate record," I continued, ensuring every word was enunciated with absolute clarity, "I do not, under any circumstances, accept the proposed 50% reduction in my total compensation. Furthermore, I do not consent to any diminution of my strategic authority or operational oversight regarding my designated accounts." I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us, letting the full weight of the consequence settle onto their shoulders. "If Halcyon attempts to forcefully implement these changes," I said, delivering the final, devastating blow, "it will instantly be classified as a hostile breach of contract. As noted in the attached document, my counsel is fully prepared to initiate formal dispute proceedings, which will immediately activate the severance and accelerated vesting clauses outlined in Section 8. I stood up, leaving the explosive documents resting between them. I did not wait for them to piece together a panicked reply. I simply turned and walked out of the room, setting in motion the very first, agonizingly slow turn of the screw. I had formally drawn the battle lines, and now, all I had to do was wait for the internal shockwaves to reach the man who thought he could buy my loyalty for half the price. Within exactly 3 hours of my departure from the Human Resources Suite, the meticulously sealed corporate ecosystem of Halcyon began to visibly fracture. The internal gossip network did not require me to speak a single word of complaint or leak a solitary document. In a towering corporate headquarters entirely fueled by anxiety and ambition, absolute silence is often the loudest possible broadcast. The indicators of my shifting status were subtle at first, then glaringly obvious. My name was suddenly and inexplicably scrubbed from the digital attendee list of the upcoming quarter-end strategy alignment. The automated approval workflows for 3 distinct regional vendor invoices abruptly returned an error message stating my administrative rights were under executive review. When I walked down the long, carpeted central corridor to retrieve a cup of hot water, junior analysts and mid-level managers suddenly found their mobile phones or the blank walls intensely fascinating. The quickly averted gazes and the hushed whispers that died the second I approached were the most telling metrics of all. They were looking at a woman they believed was already a ghost. Behind the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive suite, Blake Harlow and his inner circle were already frantically moving pieces on the board. They were operating under the sheer, arrogant delusion that decades of deeply entrenched client loyalty were as easily transferable as a company laptop. Sitting at my desk, I watched the internal directory updates quietly flash across my secondary monitor. They were systematically preparing to route my primary national healthcare accounts directly to Mason Trent. Mason was our chief operating officer, a fiercely loyal soldier to Blake, and a man who possessed a brilliant mathematical understanding of freight load distribution. However, Mason had absolutely zero history of looking a hospital procurement director in the eye during a crisis. You cannot hand a spreadsheet manager the keys to a fragile relationship built on midnight phone calls and high-stakes supply chain emergencies. Mason did not know the names of the client's spouses, nor did he understand the specific paralyzing fear of Food and Drug Administration (FDA) that kept those buyers awake at night. Blake truly thought he was neatly plugging a hole in his organizational chart. He was, in reality, pulling the pin on a live grenade. The first major detonation occurred at exactly 4:45 in the afternoon. A stark, unformatted email arrived in my inbox. with both Blake and Mason visibly copied on the thread. It was from the Senior Vice President of Purchasing at Belmont Care Alliance, our absolute largest and most demanding client in the entire southeastern region. The message was perfectly polite, devastatingly brief, and entirely devoid of standard corporate pleasantries. The client had noted the sudden, unexplained shift in calendar invites and asked one fiercely targeted question. If Nora is no longer on the front lines, who exactly will be coordinating our regional renewal next month? That single email was merely the preliminary tremor. The following morning, the localized shaking turned into a structural earthquake. By 10 o'clock, the purchasing directors from Redstone Pharmacy Network and Haverly Surgical Group had both called my direct office line. I made the deliberate, tactical decision to let the calls roll directly to my heavily monitored voicemail, effectively forcing the frantic clients to bypass me and call the executive suite instead. These seasoned executives did not yell, nor did they threaten to tear up their multi-million-dollar logistics contracts on the spot. That is not how veterans of the healthcare industry play the game. They simply expressed a deep, unsettling confusion. They asked the exact same question Blake feared most, repeating a variation of the same chilling inquiry. If Nora leaves the organization, who is actually holding the steering wheel? From my quiet office, I could almost vividly picture the blood draining from Reed Talbot's face 2 floors above me. Blake might have foolishly dismissed these client inquiries as a temporary, emotional reaction to a standard management change, but our chief financial officer lived entirely in the brutal, unforgiving realm of predictive mathematics. Reed knew fundamentally that a major client did not have to officially cancel a contract to utterly destroy our fiscal year. They only had to delay it. If Belmont or Redstone simply dragged their feet on the upcoming renewals for a mere 30 days to cautiously evaluate this sudden leadership vacuum, the projected revenue for the entire next quarter would completely flatline. Blake's aggressively marketed narrative of internal cost savings was rapidly transforming into a catastrophic, career-ending punchline. Then, the chaotic corporate environment delivered a profound, entirely unforced error directly into my waiting hands. Shortly before noon, my inbox chimed with a high-priority notification. A mid-level communications director, undoubtedly operating under immense stress and severe sleep deprivation, attempted to reply to a restricted executive email thread and accidentally hit the forward button instead, sending the entire confidential chain directly to my active address. I opened the message and meticulously read through the reverse chronological timeline of Blake's mounting panic. There, explicitly laid out in digital ink across several pages, was the executive team's premeditated strategy for desperate damage control. They were aggressively scripting a false narrative to blame any impending client volatility entirely on my supposed inability to handle pressure. The internal directives explicitly instructed the public relations team to frame my impending departure as an emotional decision rather than a legitimate business dispute over breached contracts. They were fully preparing to paint me as an unstable, irrational female executive abandoning her post during a critical transition. The visceral instinct to march upstairs, bypass the executive assistants, and slam that printed email directly onto Blake's glass table was incredibly strong. I felt the familiar, hot burn of adrenaline, the primal urge to immediately strike back and expose their carefully orchestrated lie to the entire building. But I forced my hands to remain perfectly still on the cool plastic of my keyboard. I did not forward the thread to the Human Resources Department. I did not print a physical copy. I quietly and cleanly moved the entire digital chain into a heavily encrypted external folder. Utilizing that explosive document right now would only prompt them to panic and formulate a much better, tighter lie. The most devastating blow in a corporate war of attrition is rarely the fastest reaction. The true power lies in the iron discipline required to stand completely still and allow your opponent to continue enthusiastically digging their own grave. I tucked the irrefutable evidence away, treating it as a lethal trump card, waiting for the absolute perfect moment to be played against them. While I remained completely silent and visibly compliant, my attorney, Owen Carlyle, unleashed the heavy legal artillery. Precisely at 2 p.m, A formal preservation demand and cease and desist letter arrived via registered courier directly to the desk of Miriam Sloan, with a certified digital copy immediately transmitted to the private inboxes of the entire board of directors. The document was an absolute masterpiece of aggressive legal intimidation. Owen formally placed Halcyon on notice regarding the severe contractual risks they had initiated, explicitly outlining the multi-million-dollar compensation obligations they were currently triggering with their reckless boardroom ambush. More importantly, he included a razor-sharp, unambiguous warning that any further alteration of my digital access, any forced removal from active client communications, or any internal disparagement from this exact moment forward would be documented as retaliatory action, exponentially multiplying the potential financial damages in a court of law. The atmosphere inside the Halcyon building underwent a fundamental, irreversible shift by the time the sun began to set over the Atlanta skyline. Blake Harlow stepped into the private executive elevator to head down to the secured parking garage. Normally, this confined space was immediately filled with the forced, overly enthusiastic greetings of subordinate managers absolutely desperate to catch his eye and curry favor. Today, however, as the polished steel doors slid open, the three junior executives already standing inside immediately fell dead silent. They stared straight ahead at the metal doors, their posture rigidly stiff, offering absolutely nothing but cold, suffocating air. As the elevator slowly descended toward the concrete basement, the heavy, oppressive silence confirmed a terrifying new reality for the chief executive. He was standing in the exact same towering building he had absolute command over just 24 hours ago. But the invisible, iron grip he held over his empire was now violently slipping right through his fingers. I was not invited to the emergency board meeting convened on the 75th floor that Thursday morning. I did not need to be. When you have spent over a decade observing the intricate, cutthroat machinery of a corporate empire, you do not need to sit in the room to know exactly how an execution unfolds. The sheer panic radiating from the executive suite was heavy enough to alter the air pressure in the building. The directors had been aggressively summoned with less than 12 hours of notice. They had been pulled from their private flights and quiet breakfasts because the legal department had finally hit the emergency brake. Miriam Sloan had bypassed Blake completely and delivered my attorney's formal notice directly to the chairman. She clearly explained that the aggressive ultimatum Blake had dropped on my desk did not save the corporation a single cent. Instead, it acted as a massive financial detonator. By attempting to force a 50% pay cut and stripping my authority, Blake had inadvertently activated the constructive termination and accelerated equity vesting clauses in my ironclad contract. What our chief executive had confidently pitched to the board as a bold, necessary cost-saving measure was instantly reclassified as an immediate, catastrophic financial liability. Inside the mahogany-paneled boardroom, absolutely freezing, Reed Talbot, our chief financial officer, stood at the head of the heavy glass table, sweating profusely through his expensive custom shirt. He was ordered by the chairman to stop utilizing creative accounting metrics and project the actual, unedited financial landscape onto the main screen. He could no longer hide behind glossy presentation slides. Blake had recently promised the board a miraculous margin improvement plan to cover up the disastrous automated warehouse implementation from the previous quarter. The harsh truth was now glaringly bright on the wall for everyone to see. There was no strategic realignment happening. I was simply the largest number Blake could find to hastily patch a sinking ship. He had treated my livelihood as a slush fund to hide his own operational failures. Dana Mercer sat at the far end of the long table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When the chairman sharply asked how this massive legal liability was allowed to proceed without board approval, she did not hesitate to save herself. Corporate loyalty only extends to the edge of the cliff. Dana unzipped her leather portfolio and pulled out a stack of printed memorandums. She calmly informed the room that she had submitted formal, written warnings 3 weeks prior. She had explicitly stated on the record that altering my compensation structure in such a violent manner would trigger severe legal consequences and cause a highly dangerous ripple effect across our core healthcare accounts. Blake had entirely ignored the human resources mandate. he had ordered her to draft the paperwork anyway, relying purely on his ego to intimidate me into quiet submission. Several of the older, more detached board members had initially viewed this entire crisis as a standard personnel dispute. They assumed I was merely a disgruntled senior director throwing a temporary tantrum over a reduced annual bonus. Their perspective shattered the moment Reed advanced to the next slide. The screen displayed the upcoming contract renewal pipeline for the next 12 months. He reluctantly highlighted the specific accounts entirely managed by me. The room went dead still. The directors stared in horror at a solid block of revenue representing nearly 1/3 of the company's most critical financial lifelines for the upcoming year. I was not just another manager occupying a corner office. I was the central, load-bearing pillar holding their entire roof up. Blake, sensing the walls rapidly closing in on him, attempted to desperately minimize the bleeding. He leaned heavily over the table, using his best, most authoritative cadence. "Clients buy the infrastructure of Halcyon," Blake argued, his voice tight and defensive. "They buy our refrigerated trucks, our cold storage capacity, and our national reach. They do not buy a single person. Absolutely no employee is bigger than the corporate brand." The silence that followed his statement was heavier than lead. It was the deeply uncomfortable silence of seasoned men and women who actually understood the logistics industry. In a sector where a delayed shipment could ruin millions of dollars of temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals, clients did not trust the trucks. They trusted the specific person who answered their frantic phone calls at 3 a.m. They trusted personal accountability, not a colorful corporate logo. Blake's arrogant statement proved to the entire room that he fundamentally did not understand the very business he was supposed to be leading. Miriam Sloan interjected smoothly before Blake could speak again. Her tone was strictly clinical, completely devoid of any supportive warmth. "We have received formal notice from her attorney," Miriam stated clearly. "If we proceed with locking her out of the internal systems, demoting her title, or attempting to disparage her reputation in any way, we will severely compound our legal exposure. Any retaliatory action taken after this specific moment will simply hand her legal counsel a definitive victory in court. We are currently paralyzed." At the exact center of the table sat Arthur Vance. Arthur was an independent board member known throughout the industry for his ruthless efficiency and his complete lack of patience for executive posturing. He slowly took off his silver reading glasses, tapped them exactly once on the wood, and looked directly into the eyes of the chief executive. "Blake," Arthur began, his voice barely above a whisper, carrying the lethal, precise weight of a targeted strike. "If you are willing to risk our most critical national contracts, jeopardize 1/3 of our projected revenue, and invite a massive lawsuit just to force a female executive to take half of her promised compensation, I have to ask a very simple question. What else exactly have you been misrepresenting to us?" The single tap of Arthur's glasses on the table was the loudest sound in the room. It was the definitive sound of trust fracturing permanently. While the leadership team of Halcyon was trapped in a soundproof room, tearing each other apart, 250 miles away in Charlotte, the machinery of a very different empire was quietly powering up. North Forge Logistics had not made a single public announcement. However, within the secure confines of their financial planning departments, senior analysts were actively running new, confidential financial models. Evelyn Drake was moving pieces on the board with silent, deadly precision. They were aggressively allocating capital budgets for a brand new national growth division. They were meticulously building a massive golden door, preparing to swing it wide open just as Halcyon blindly welded theirs shut. I could feel the absolute shift in the atmosphere without even looking at a screen. The momentum had entirely changed hands. The board of directors did not terminate Blake Harlow's employment that Thursday afternoon. That action would have been far too merciful, far too swift. High-level corporate executions require a meticulous, agonizingly slow building of consensus to protect the stock price. Instead, they completely stripped him of his autonomy. The chairman formally decreed that an independent, external legal firm would immediately begin a comprehensive, microscopic audit of every single decision Blake had made regarding my employment contract and the subsequent financial fallout. Blake was forced to surrender all his authority over the matter. He had confidently walked into that boardroom, believing he was the untouchable man holding the knife. He walked out realizing, with absolute terror, that he was now the one pinned securely under the blinding heat of the interrogation lamp. Instead of retreating to assess the massive legal crater he had just stepped into, Blake Harlow chose to accelerate straight over the cliff. It is a fatal flaw in a certain breed of corporate executive. When cornered by their own incompetence, they do not seek counsel, they seek control. By Friday morning, the digital architecture of my daily life at Halcyon began to systematically collapse. I sat at my desk, sipping lukewarm tea, watching the retaliatory strike unfold in real time across my dual monitors. First came the calendar notifications. A swift succession of automated emails popped into the corner of my screen, informing me that my attendance was no longer required for two critical, multi-million-dollar regional renewal meetings scheduled for the following week. Immediately after, my access to the central client management database was abruptly severed. When I attempted to pull the preliminary quarterly reports for my top accounts, the screen simply flashed a gray error box indicating my security clearance had been downgraded by the system administrator. I did not panic. I simply picked up my phone and opened the internal directory. Blake had not just removed me, he had hastily assigned Mason Trent as the primary lead for both of those major renewals. The sheer desperation of the move was breathtaking. Blake was actively locking out the only person who understood the complex compliance history of those specific accounts, replacing me with a man who could barely navigate a standard vendor spreadsheet. This was no longer a theoretical debate about a proposed pay cut. Blake had just weaponized the corporate infrastructure against me, transforming his initial boardroom threat into a highly documented, brutally obvious chain of retaliation. Every revoked permission, every altered calendar invite, and every digital lock he engaged created an indelible, time-stamped paper trail. I immediately called my attorney. "Owen," I said, keeping my voice low and perfectly steady, "I need you to check your secure server. I am forwarding you 4 separate system notifications." Blake just officially locked me out of the primary client database and formally removed me from 2 major upcoming renewal negotiations. A sharp, incredulous bark of laughter echoed through the phone. Even a seasoned labor attorney like Owen Carlisle was struggling to process the sheer magnitude of Blake's stupidity. "You have to be joking," Owen said, the amusement in his voice rapidly sharpening into predatory focus. "We served them with a formal preservation demand less than 24 hours ago. We explicitly warned them that altering your operational authority would be categorized as active retaliation. I almost cannot believe he's being this reckless. He is handing us the entire case wrapped in a bow." "He is panicking," I replied, watching another access denial banner flash across my screen. "He needs to prove to the building that he is still in command. Draft the supplement." "I am drafting it right now," Owen confirmed, the rapid clacking of his keyboard audible in the background. "I will send a supplemental legal notice directly to their general counsel before noon. We will explicitly state that these immediate changes to your core functions, executed immediately after a formal contract dispute has been initiated, serve as undeniable, corroborating evidence for our claim of constructive termination. We have him completely pinned." While Owen prepared to drop a second legal bomb on the executive suite, a much larger, completely uncontained explosion occurred outside the walls of Halcyon. The purchasing director for Belmont Care Alliance did not bother calling Blake to complain about the sudden shift in account leadership. Men at that level of healthcare procurement do not waste time arguing with drowning executives. Instead, he bypassed the entire operational hierarchy and placed a direct private phone call to a senior member of the Halcyon Board of Directors. The message delivered was brutally concise. The purchasing director stated that Belmont Care Alliance required absolute ironclad stability in their supply chain leadership to maintain federal compliance. Because Halcyon could no longer demonstrate that stability, Belmont would not be authorizing their scheduled automatic contract renewal. Instead, they were preparing to formally reopen the entire Southeastern regional bidding process to the open market. The news hit the executive floor like a shockwave. Through the glass walls of my office, I could see Reed Talbot practically sprinting down the corridor, his face the color of wet ash. Our chief financial officer was experiencing genuine, unadulterated terror. In the logistics industry, a reopened bid from a massive anchor client like Belmont is never an isolated incident. It is the first domino in a catastrophic chain reaction. The moment the market realizes Belmont is actively looking for a new vendor, every other major healthcare network standing on the sidelines will immediately pause their own renewals to reevaluate the landscape. As the Halcyon leadership team scrambled to extinguish the raging fire they had intentionally started, my encrypted personal email chimed. It was a secure, password-protected attachment from North Forge Logistics. I opened the document and read through a highly detailed, confidential preliminary offer. Evelyn Drake did not deal in vague promises. The term sheet was spectacular. The proposed title was President of Strategic Markets. The package included absolute authority to construct and hire my own internal team, a massive allocation of long-term equity, and a brilliant, legally insulated strategy to expand their national footprint without immediately triggering the restrictive covenants in my Halcyon contract. North Forge was offering me an empire. I picked up my phone and dialed Evelyn's direct line. She answered immediately, clearly expecting me to accept the terms on the spot. "The structure is flawless, Evelyn," I said, leaning back in my chair. "The autonomy is exactly what we discussed. But I am not going to sign it today." There was a brief, highly uncharacteristic silence on the other end of the line. Evelyn was a woman accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted, exactly when she offered it. "Nora," Evelyn said, her tone cautious but deeply curious, "you have the capital backing, the title, and the legal clearance. The building you are currently standing in is actively burning down. Why exactly are you waiting?" "Because I am not waiting to be rescued," I explained, my eyes tracking the frantic movements of the junior executives outside my office door. "If I sign a contract with North Forge today and abruptly resign from Halcyon tomorrow, Blake will immediately seize control of the narrative. He will tell the board, the industry, and the clients that I orchestrated this entire crisis as a premeditated exit strategy. He will paint himself as the victim of corporate espionage." I paused, ensuring the cold reality of my strategy was perfectly clear. I need the story to remain entirely his fault. He is currently thrashing. He is retaliating, he is violating legal warnings, and he is terrifying the primary clients. I am waiting for him to make the final, fatal mistake that absolutely no public relations team can spin in his favor. When I finally walk out that door, I need the entire industry to know I was violently pushed. Not that I eagerly jumped. Evelyn let out a low, deeply appreciative breath. "Understood," she replied, the respect in her voice absolute. "Take exactly the time you need. The offer remains firmly on the table. Watch your back in that building, Nora." "I always do," I said, and ended the call. I placed my phone on the desk just as it began to quietly vibrate with a steady stream of incoming text messages. They were not from North Forge, nor were they from Owen. They were from the mid-level managers, the regional dispatchers, and the senior warehouse supervisors inside Halcyon. They were using their personal phones, carefully bypassing the monitored corporate networks. They were not asking me to secure them jobs at a rival company. They were simply reaching out to ask if I was okay. They were telling me that the new directives from Mason Trent made absolutely zero sense. They were confirming their loyalty. It was a quiet, powerful testament to a fundamental truth Blake had entirely failed to comprehend. He thought power was derived strictly from a job title and a signature on a paycheck. He never understood that true operational power is built on a decade of shared late nights, solved crises, and absolute mutual respect. My roots in this company ran infinitely deeper than his fragile executive ego. I sat in my partially locked-out office, surrounded by the invisible hum of an empire preparing to tear itself apart. I mentally drafted my acceptance of the North Forge terms, signing the invisible contract in my mind. The future was completely secured, but physically, I kept my hands folded neatly on my desk. I would not put pen to paper yet. The absolute sweetest form of revenge was not a sudden, explosive departure. The sweetest revenge was sitting perfectly still, letting my opponent continue to aggressively bleed out, all while he desperately believed he still had room to negotiate a surrender. The corporate machine of Halcyon attempted to regain control of the narrative early Monday morning. At exactly 8 o'clock, a company-wide memorandum landed in every employee inbox. It was a masterpiece of cowardly public relations spin. The subject line read simply, "Leadership Transition Update." The body of the email delicately suggested that I was taking time to consider a shift in my personal career trajectory. It was a calculated, transparent effort to paint me as an unpredictable executive who was voluntarily creating instability, effectively absolving the chief executive of any wrongdoing. They wanted the rank and file to believe I was abandoning the ship, completely ignoring the fact that Blake Harlow had just tried to throw me overboard. But truth in a decaying system operates like water. It always finds the cracks. Just hours after the internal communications team released that insulting memorandum, a highly confidential internal compensation spreadsheet mysteriously found its way directly onto the desks of the Board of Directors Compensation Committee. I did not send it. The building was full of people who had watched Blake operate with impunity for far too long, and someone finally decided to pull a loose thread. The document outlined the total remuneration packages for the entire senior leadership tier. It revealed a glaring, undeniable pattern. Several male directors, men who managed a fraction of my client portfolio and consistently delivered significantly weaker quarterly results, had their lucrative salaries completely preserved. Some had even quietly received substantial merit increases. While this leaked spreadsheet did not immediately constitute a formalized legal claim of discrimination, it served a much more immediate, devastating purpose. It completely obliterated Blake's primary defense. He had stood in front of the board and confidently declared that my 50% reduction was a necessary market alignment. The ink on that spreadsheet proved the market alignment only applied to the woman who was holding the most critical medical accounts together. The hypocrisy was now a documented, undeniable corporate record. Dana Mercer found herself trapped in an impossible, rapidly shrinking space. Our head of human resources knew that when an arrogant chief executive is backed into a corner by the board of directors, he will inevitably look for a subordinate to sacrifice. If Blake attempted to claim that human resources had advised or endorsed the disastrous reduction strategy, Dana would be the one facing the firing squad. But Dana was a survivor. Her signature was already securely attached to the prior written warnings explicitly advising against touching my contract. She was quietly preparing her own defensive perimeter. If Blake pointed a single finger in her direction, she was fully prepared to walk into the boardroom and lay out the complete, unvarnished truth, effectively acting as the final nail in his coffin. The sheer, suffocating pressure finally broke Blake's rigid posture. By Tuesday afternoon, he abandoned the aggressive retaliatory tactics and shifted into an absolute panic. He bypassed his assistants and came directly to my office, closing the door firmly behind him. He looked ragged, his usual immaculate presentation ruined by the deep, dark circles under his eyes. "Nora, we need to reset this entire situation," Blake said, his voice carrying a thin, desperate edge that he tried unsuccessfully to mask as executive authority. The market correction initiative was applied too broadly. I am prepared to fully restore your compensation to 100% of your original contract. We will upgrade your title to Senior Vice President, and I have authorization to issue a substantial, six-figure retention bonus to ensure we keep your talent in this building. He stood there, waiting for me to express profound gratitude for the return of the salary he had attempted to steal just days prior. He completely omitted any apology for the profound insult. He made absolutely no mention of reversing the lockouts, restoring my operational authority, or addressing the hostile environment he had intentionally engineered. He believed he could simply buy his way out of a burning building. As I listened to his frantic transactional promises, a profound realization crystallized in my mind. I looked past his sweating brow and mentally calculated the exact dates on my corporate calendar. This entire chaotic incident had never been about a simple quarterly budget adjustment. It was a remarkably cold, deeply calculated conspiracy. In exactly 10 days, a massive multi-year tranche of my deferred executive equity was scheduled to automatically unlock and fully vest. It was the largest single payout of my entire 11-year tenure. Blake had not merely wanted to save money on my base salary. He had intentionally orchestrated a brutal, humiliating boardroom ambush designed to force me to quit in anger before that 10-day window closed. He wanted me to voluntarily walk away from millions of dollars in earned stock so the company could absorb the equity back into their own depleted ledgers. This was not a hot-headed mistake made by a stressed leader in a glass room. This was premeditated financial sabotage. If Arthur Vance and the rest of the board recognized this specific timeline, Blake's actions would instantly transition from poor management to a malicious breach of fiduciary duty. He would not just be fired, he would be utterly destroyed in the professional sector. "I will take your new proposal under advisement, Blake," I replied smoothly, revealing absolutely nothing of the lethal truth I had just uncovered. "I need to review the exact terms with my counsel before I make any definitive commitments." He nodded tightly, eager to escape the cold air of my office, foolishly believing he had successfully reopened the door for negotiation. As soon as he left, I opened my encrypted personal tablet. Evelyn Drake had sent over the finalized strategic blueprint for North Forge Logistics. It was a masterpiece of aggressive market entry. Evelyn was brilliant enough to know we could not simply raid Halcyon's active roster on day one without triggering an exhausting legal war over my restrictive covenants. Instead, she had built a comprehensive plan targeting the vast, lucrative middle market that Halcyon had grown too arrogant to service. We would aggressively pursue the fresh regional bids that Blake had routinely ignored, build out the neglected transportation routes in the rural southeast, and approach the businesses that had previously felt alienated by Halcyon's massive, impersonal corporate structure. It was an entirely new, legally pristine frontier, and Evelyn was handing me the absolute authority to conquer it. I sat in the quiet stillness of my office, a space that had served as my professional home for over a decade. The walls were lined with the framed awards and signed vendor agreements that represented thousands of hours of my life. But the sentimental attachment was completely gone, replaced by a sharp, invigorating clarity. I opened the secure portal containing the official North Forge employment contract. I did not feel a trace of the desperation that Blake had so desperately tried to instill in me. I felt the profound electric weight of true autonomy. For the first time in years, I was not being asked to shrink my presence, justify my worth, or accept a fraction of what I had earned. I was being actively invited to build an empire, with a steady hand and a perfectly calm heart. I typed my legally binding digital signature onto the North Forge agreement and pressed submit. I locked my tablet, slipped it into my leather bag, and smiled. The war was officially over, and the man 2 floors above me had absolutely no idea he was already a ghost. My final day at Halcyon was aggressively anticlimactic. Owen Carlyle ensured the separation agreement was executed with surgical precision, heavily insulating me from any future corporate claims of intellectual property theft or client solicitation. I surrendered my encrypted laptop, my mobile device, and my security badge to a silent human resources representative in a small windowless room. I did not give a tearful farewell speech to the national sales floor. I did not pack a cardboard box with sentimental desk ornaments. I simply walked out of the heavy glass double doors and let the magnetic locks engage behind me with a solid, definitive click. Blake Harlow firmly believed that my physical absence would immediately stop his internal bleeding, but he fundamentally misunderstood the structural integrity of his own company. When you violently rip a load-bearing column out of a towering structure, the roof does not collapse on the very first day. It groans, it shifts out of alignment, and then the microscopic fractures slowly begin to spread across the foundation. Mason Trent inherited my regional portfolio exactly as Blake had mandated. However, Inheriting a vast database of phone numbers is entirely different from inheriting a decade of hard-earned trust. Reports from my former client network reached my private phone almost instantly, transmitted through the quiet, highly efficient industry whisper network. During his very first introductory video conference with the procurement board of a major metropolitan hospital system, Mason relied entirely on standardized slide decks and mechanical cost projection metrics. He completely failed to recognize the subtle, nonverbal cues indicating the chief medical officer was deeply anxious about an upcoming federal regulatory audit, where I would have intuitively paused the financial presentation to address their compliance fears directly. Mason plowed straight ahead. He aggressively recited profit margins and freight distribution algorithms, treating a highly sensitive human relationship like a basic algebra equation. The hospital executives were not outwardly hostile, but they immediately recognized the terrifying truth. They were no longer dealing with a strategic partner who understood their daily operational terror. They were dealing with a rigid corporate machine. The theoretical risk Blake had so casually dismissed manifested into a brutal physical reality exactly 12 days after my departure. A critical cold chain transit hub located in the Deep South suffered a catastrophic power routing failure. The resulting logistical bottleneck delayed a massive, highly sensitive shipment of temperature-controlled oncology medications by nearly 6 hours. In the volatile world of commercial freight, a 6-hour delay is a minor inconvenience. In the highly regulated world of medical logistics, a 6-hour delay borders on a cardinal sin, risking the complete spoilage of life-saving inventory. The delay did not trigger an immediate contract termination, but it shattered the fragile illusion of control Halcyon had been projecting. Within 24 hours of the incident, 3 of Halcyon's largest national accounts simultaneously issued formal, legally binding demands for a comprehensive, independent audit of our regional oversight protocols. The clients were no longer taking the chief executive's arrogant assurances at face value. They demanded to see the actual operational blueprints, specifically questioning the glaring absence of my signature on the newly drafted contingency plans. From his isolated corner office, Reed Talbot stared at the revised quarterly forecast and saw the true paralyzing shape of the nightmare. None of the major medical networks were aggressively tearing up their active agreements overnight. Massive healthcare conglomerates simply do not operate with that kind of reckless speed. Instead, they employed a far more devastating and insidious tactic. They simply stopped moving. The lucrative contract renewals that were scheduled to be finalized that month were indefinitely placed on hold, pending the results of the requested audits. The projected revenue column for the upcoming fiscal quarter transformed from a robust, guaranteed financial foundation into a terrifying, empty void. The entire corporate ecosystem began to suffocate from a complete lack of forward momentum, 200 miles away. My transition into the North Forge logistics infrastructure was entirely devoid of theatrical triumph. I did not enter the Charlotte headquarters to the sound of applause or mythical fanfare. I walked into the building as a seasoned, lethal professional reporting for active duty. Evelyn Drake had prepared a corner office for me, stripped of any superficial luxury but heavily equipped with high-tier data terminals and a direct secure line to her own desk. We wasted absolutely zero time on corporate orientation or celebratory lunches. Evelyn stood in the doorway of my new office on my first morning and set the tone immediately. "You have full authorization to build your own intelligence division," Evelyn said, her voice sharp and focused. "I want a regional strategy designed by Friday, and I want us opening dialogues with every single enterprise client that Halcyon has alienated over the past 2 years. You will have the preliminary targets on your desk by Thursday," I replied, never taking my eyes off the glowing data streams on my monitors. I spent my first 2 weeks aggressively interviewing elite supply chain analysts, designing localized market penetration strategies, and mapping out the specific geographic territories Blake had systematically neglected. We did not immediately attack my former client base. That would have been strategically clumsy and legally perilous, potentially violating the strict non-solicitation clauses Owen had so carefully negotiated. Instead, I directed my newly formed division to target Crestline Home Health. Crestline was an immensely profitable, rapidly expanding regional network that Blake had repeatedly dismissed as being too small and too geographically dispersed to warrant dedicated executive attention. I knew exactly what Crestline desperately needed, because I had spent 3 years watching Halcyon utterly ignore their requests for specialized rural routing. While Blake was entirely consumed by the raging internal fires he had intentionally started, my team calmly drafted a bespoke logistics proposal tailored entirely to Crestline's unique delivery challenges. We secured the exclusive, multi-year contract within 14 days. It was a massive, highly visible victory for North Forge, achieved not by poaching a disgruntled former client, but by cleanly outmaneuvering a crippled competitor that was entirely distracted by its own civil war. Back in Atlanta, the internal pressure cooker finally blew its lid. As the board of directors intensified their independent investigation into the botched compensation strategy and the subsequent revenue freeze, Blake desperately searched for a human shield. During a tense, closed-door executive alignment meeting, he subtly but aggressively suggested that the Human Resources Department had failed to properly gauge my emotional stability. He heavily implied to the remaining leadership team that Dana Mercer should bear the administrative responsibility for the escalating public relations disaster. It was a fatal terminal miscalculation. Dana was not a silent, obedient soldier willing to fall on her sword for an incompetent king. She did not argue or attempt to defend herself in the room. She walked directly out of that meeting, returned to her private desk, and drafted her formal, irrevocable letter of resignation. She refused to sign a non-disclosure agreement or accept a quiet severance package upon her exit. By attempting to make her the designated scapegoat, Blake transformed a quiet observer into a highly motivated, incredibly dangerous witness. She possessed complete, unrestricted access to every single buried warning, ignored email, and rejected legal mandate that Blake had ever issued. The fundamental balance of power had permanently and violently shifted. I was sitting in a brightly lit office in North Forge, building a formidable new division from the ground up, having definitively proven that my strategic value was never tied to a single corporate logo. I no longer had to fight to justify my worth to an arrogant man in a glass room. Blake Harlow, however, was trapped in an increasingly isolated tower, completely surrounded by delayed renewals, catastrophic operational failures, and fleeing executive officers. He was no longer trying to prove he was a strong, uncompromising leader. He was desperately, hopelessly trying to prove he was not the arsonist who had deliberately set his own empire on fire. The logistics industry is surprisingly small, operating on a complex web of deeply entrenched relationships. In an ecosystem like this, secrets possess the lifespan of a housefly. By the middle of my 3rd week at North Forge Logistics, the quiet, architectural phase of our new division was entirely complete. We were aggressively preparing to take the operational structure public. The industry whispers had already saturated the executive lounges, the vendor trade floors, and the private golf courses across the eastern seaboard. Everyone who actually mattered in the medical supply chain knew that North Forge was assembling a massive national growth syndicate, and they knew exactly who was sitting at the head of the table. It was a Tuesday evening, just past 6 o'clock. I was sitting at my new desk, reviewing the final draft of our official market entry strategy, when my personal cellular phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood. The screen displayed an unlisted Atlanta area code. It was not the official Halcyon Legal Department routing number. It was not Human Resources trying to negotiate a final exit survey. I recognized the private prefix immediately. I let the device ring 3 full times before sliding my finger across the glass to answer. I did not offer a polite greeting. Nora, the voice on the other end, belonged to Blake Harlow, but the arrogant, booming resonance that used to easily command towering boardrooms was entirely absent. He sounded hollowed out. There was a tight, hyper-controlled cadence to his words, but the microscopic cracks of profound, unadulterated desperation were absolutely impossible to hide. He was a man speaking from the bottom of a very deep, rapidly flooding well, fully aware that the board of directors standing above him was currently deciding whether or not to cut the rope. "I am listening," I said, leaning back into my leather chair and resting my eyes on the shimmering Charlotte skyline outside my office window. "We need to fix this," Blake started, rushing the words slightly, completely abandoning the slow, deliberate pacing he usually employed for executive intimidation. "The situation has spiraled out of our control, and I am stepping in to personally correct the trajectory. I am officially tossing out the previous proposals. I am prepared to offer a full restoration of your original compensation package. In addition, I have secured provisional board approval for a mid-six-figure retention bonus, payable immediately upon your return to the building. We will elevate your title to Executive Vice President of National Accounts. You come back, and we will entirely rewrite your future at this company." He stopped talking, waiting for the sheer financial weight of his panicked offer to crush my resolve. He honestly believed he was extending a golden bridge that I would eagerly run across. I did not reply immediately. In any high-stakes corporate negotiation, absolute silence is the heaviest, most lethal weapon you can wield. I let the quiet stretch across the cellular connection for 5 full seconds, forcing him to sit alone in the suffocating void of his own making. When I finally spoke, my voice was entirely devoid of anger, devoid of triumph, and completely devoid of warmth. It was the clinical, absolute tone of a medical examiner stating an official time of death. "You did not lose me when I walked out of that building, Blake," I said softly, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "You lost me the exact moment you slammed your hand on a glass table and thought you could cut my value in half on a piece of paper." I could hear a sharp, ragged intake of breath on his end of the line. The terrifying reality of my permanent detachment was finally beginning to penetrate his thick, reinforced armor of corporate hubris. "Nora, you have to understand the environment," Blake pleaded, his voice dropping an octave, desperately attempting to feign an intimate camaraderie that had never existed between us. "We were under immense pressure. The end of the fiscal quarter was closing in. The profit margins were razor thin, and I had to make sweeping budgetary decisions across the board. It was a chaotic environment. It was a massive misunderstanding fueled entirely by administrative stress." I sat forward, my grip tightening slightly on the metal edge of my phone. I absolutely refused to let him retreat behind the cowardly, convenient shield of quarterly financial pressure. "Do not insult my intelligence by blaming the fiscal calendar," I countered, my words striking like heavy, deliberate hammer blows. "A misunderstanding is a misplaced decimal point on a vendor spreadsheet. What you executed in that boardroom was a highly calculated ambush. You did not just insult my professional worth. The moment I pushed back, you instantly locked my administrative access. You quietly handed my most sensitive client relationships to a subordinate who was completely unqualified to manage them. You directed your internal communications team to draft a false narrative to blame the resulting instability on my supposed emotional state." I paused, letting the irrefutable, documented facts hang heavily in the air between us before delivering the final, fatal stroke. "And most importantly," I continued, lowering my voice to a lethal whisper, "you deliberately timed the entire execution to force my resignation exactly 10 days before my long-term equity was scheduled to automatically vest. That was not quarterly pressure. That was premeditated theft." The line went completely, utterly dead silent. He had absolutely no counter-argument. He realized, in that freezing moment, that I had seen the absolute bottom of his character. There was no amount of corporate capital or hollow titles that could buy his way back into my grace. Simultaneously, 250 miles away in Atlanta, a much heavier silence was descending upon the Halcyon executive suite. At that exact moment, the independent legal counsel retained by Arthur Vance was distributing thick, securely bound copies of their final investigative audit directly to the board of directors. The pages contained an unvarnished, devastating timeline of failure. The report explicitly confirmed that Blake had willfully ignored repeated, written warnings from the Human Resources Department regarding my contractual protections. It highlighted his blatant, intentional misrepresentation of the severe client retention risks. The final summary paragraph concluded that the chief executive had recklessly exposed the corporation to millions of dollars in legal liability and massive, irreversible revenue hemorrhaging, all in a failed, arrogant attempt to temporarily manipulate the quarterly ledger. The board members were quietly reading the indisputable proof that the man they had trusted to steer the ship was actively drilling massive holes directly into the hull. Please, Blake finally whispered into the phone, stripping away the very last remnants of his commanding executive persona. The grand offer of elevated titles and massive retention bonuses evaporated, replaced by the naked, pathetic tone of a man begging for his professional life. Before I could formulate a response to his pleading, Evelyn Drake walked into my office. She held a sleek digital tablet in her hand. She did not say a single word. She simply smiled a dangerous, predatory smile and turned the screen toward me. It was the finalized North Forge Internal Communications Bulletin, slated for immediate company-wide distribution at 8 o'clock the following morning. The bold header proudly announced my appointment as the supreme architect of their new national healthcare division. The industry was about to formally recognize the massive shift in power. Blake heard the faint, ambient rustle of movement in my office. The realization finally hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was not negotiating a return. He was calling a woman who was already wearing the uniform of his most lethal adversary. "This conversation has reached its logical conclusion," I said smoothly, my eyes reading over the brilliant corporate strategy Evelyn had just handed me. "Take care of yourself, Blake." I pressed the red icon on my screen, severing the connection completely. I placed the phone face down on my desk, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure wash over the room. There was no screaming, no dramatic throwing of office supplies, no cinematic explosions. There was only the quiet, incredibly satisfying hum of a well-oiled machine moving forward into the future. In his sprawling, isolated office on the top floor of the Halcyon building, Blake Harlow sat entirely alone. The sun had completely set over Atlanta, casting long, dark shadows across the expensive leather furniture and the silent glass table where he had so confidently started this war. His phone rested uselessly in his trembling hand. For the first time in his entire arrogant career, he was forced to sit in the absolute dark and listen to the true, suffocating silence of total defeat rapidly closing in around him. The absolute collapse of a corporate regime rarely happens during regular business hours. It usually occurs on a weekend, behind heavily tinted glass, when the financial bleeding becomes simply too massive to conceal. On a cold Saturday morning, the Halcyon Board of Directors convened an emergency session. There were no polite greetings, no catered pastries, and absolutely no patients left in the room. The crisis had officially breached the hull. 3 of our largest national healthcare groups had formally notified the company that they were indefinitely suspending their contract renewals. Furthermore, 2 massive new regional bids had just slipped directly into the hands of our competitors, accompanied by explicit feedback stating that Halcyon was currently viewed as structurally unstable and lacking reliable leadership. Miriam Sloan did not wait for the chairman to ask for a status report. She walked into the boardroom and dropped a massive, heavily documented binder directly onto the center of the mahogany table. As the chief legal counsel, she was legally obligated to protect the corporation, which now required completely destroying the chief executive. She presented the unvarnished timeline. She displayed the initial human resources warnings that had been blatantly ignored. She laid out the aggressive legal preservation letters sent by my attorney, Owen Carlisle. She provided the digital logs proving Blake had initiated retaliatory lockouts. Finally, she projected the damning internal email chain where Blake and his loyalists had actively conspired to blame the entire impending financial disaster on my supposed emotional instability. Before her departure, Dana Mercer had delivered one final, devastating parting gift to the legal department. She had handed over her original, handwritten, time-stamped notes from the very first boardroom meeting. The notes unequivocally proved that Blake had been explicitly warned about the catastrophic risks of altering my contract. Yet he had consciously chosen to slam his hand on the table and force an illegal ultimatum anyway. Trapped under the unforgiving glare of the board, Reed Talbot finally broke. Our chief financial officer realized that going down with a sinking ship was not a requirement of his job description. Sweating through his collar, Reed confessed to the entire room that the aggressive cost-saving narrative Blake had aggressively pushed was a complete fabrication. He admitted that my proposed 50% salary reduction was never about realigning with the market. It was a desperate, chaotic attempt to frantically cover the massive profit margin deficit caused entirely by Blake's disastrous warehouse automation project. But the fatal blow, the absolute kill shot that permanently ended Blake Harlow's career, came from Arthur Vance. The veteran board member had spent the previous night meticulously reviewing the exact dates of my employment contract. He looked across the table at Blake, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He pointed out the exact timeline. Blake had intentionally orchestrated the entire hostile push to force my resignation mere days before my massive multi-year equity package was scheduled to vest. Blake was not just a tough executive making difficult financial choices. He was a remarkably short-sighted, incredibly dangerous liability who had engaged in premeditated financial sabotage against a senior leader. While the halcyon boardroom was transforming into an execution chamber, I was sitting hundreds of miles away in my brightly lit office at North Forge Logistics. The air here was entirely different. It was crisp, focused, and completely free of toxic paranoia. I was not waiting anxiously for updates from Atlanta. I was busy building. I picked up my favorite silver pen and signed the final execution page of a massive, multi-year strategic growth contract. It was the very first major victory for my newly established division. The agreement was entirely legal, completely independent of my former Halcyon portfolio, and incredibly lucrative. It was the definitive, undeniable proof that my professional value was never tethered to the corporate logo on my previous business cards. My personal phone rested on the corner of my desk. At exactly 11 o'clock that morning, the screen illuminated. It was Blake calling one last time. I did not silence it. I simply let it ring, watching the light flash until the call rolled over to voicemail. I had absolutely nothing left to say to a ghost, because I did not answer. Blake was forced to walk back into that boardroom entirely empty-handed. The board of directors did not deliberate for long. The vote was completely unanimous. They terminated Blake Harlow immediately, officially citing gross negligence and severe breach of fiduciary duty. Because he was fired for cause, the board aggressively denied him his lucrative golden parachute. There was no graceful exit package, no transitional consulting agreement, and no polite public relations statement thanking him for his service. They appointed a veteran board member as the interim chief executive and immediately ordered the legal department to stop the bleeding by any means necessary. By Monday morning, Halcyon officially surrendered. Owen Carlyle received a phone call from their external counsel, and the capitulation was absolute. They agreed to every single demand we placed on the table. They paid out my comprehensive severance package in full. They authorized the immediate, accelerated vesting of every single share of equity they had so desperately tried to steal from me. They provided a legally binding, strictly neutral professional reference and signed an ironclad non-disparagement clause with severe financial penalties for any future violations. Simultaneously, North Forge Logistics released a massive, highly publicized press release to the entire industry. They proudly announced my arrival, positioning me as the primary architect and the public face of their aggressive new national expansion phase. The contrast was beautifully stark. Halcyon was publicly bleeding out, while North Forge was confidently claiming the future. I stood by the massive glass window of my new office, looking out over the sprawling sunlit skyline of Charlotte. My phone buzzed in my hand with a short text message from a trusted former colleague back in Atlanta. The message simply stated that Blake Harlow had just been escorted out of the Halcyon building through the basement freight elevator, carrying a single cardboard box, flanked by 2 silent security guards. I did not smile. I did not feel the sudden, fiery rush of vindictive joy that people often associate with revenge. Instead, I felt a profound, heavy sense of absolute peace. The sweetest, most devastating retaliation was not found in humiliating him or destroying his reputation. He had managed to accomplish that entirely on his own. The true victory was realizing that I had taken his arrogant command to take 50% less or leave, and I had turned it into an exclusive invitation to step into a much larger, infinitely more powerful life. I was standing in a towering new building, leading a massive new division, where his absolute biggest rival was eagerly paying my full worth just to prove that he had catastrophically mispriced the most dangerous woman who had ever sat at his table. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.